So today what I'm going to be working on is getting ready for the legs to go onto my bench. What we're pointed at here in the corner right now is the tail vise on my bench, and this is sort of one of the things that has been a sticky spot for me now in planning out the legs. I've been following in some ways a design of the Roubo workbench, and this is a view from the top of what that bench would look like. The joints that you see here, these are kind of a mortise and tenon joint that is made into the tops of all the legs. Now, one of the problems that I'm running into is this bench has essentially a face vise on the end of the bench rather than a tail vise the way that I have that takes up this long section. The only problem with that is that if I cut into the bench here in order to make room for the joinery for the leg, then this section here has very small short grain. The grain of the wood is going in this direction. So if I cut it here, it's very easy for this chunk of wood to simply fall out. So I want to be careful that I don't cut too close to that joint. What that means, this is 18 inches into this vise. So it means that the legs of the table are suddenly ending up about 2 feet in from either end. A similar thing on the other end is that I have the face vise down here, and the face vise has lag bolts and other hardware that's going through it as well. So I have a similar issue down there in that I can't put the leg too close to the end of the table, or I'm going to be running into hardware, I'm going to be running into problems. Now, one thing that I considered was, well, I can make the front legs where the vices are that far in, 2 feet, and then at the back, like back here, I could put the leg further out towards the outside edge of the table. But what that means is that the cross bracing that's supposed to go between these two legs suddenly wouldn't line up. If I had a leg here and a leg here, this would become more complicated. So I think what I've decided is I'm gonna do the legs further in the table. The bench is pretty heavy, and I think that it's still going to be quite stable, even with the legs fairly set back. The way that it's done in the Roubo table, they're inset 12 inches. So we're going to go twice that, but his bench is 72 inches long in total. And my bench is 97. So I think that the math, hopefully, is going to work out. So I'm going to do some basic lines using my measuring tape just to get a layout. I have my Starrett square, and I'm going to make this 2 feet from the end of the bench. My pencil's pretty sharp, but I'm just going to use it for these big pieces. And then once I actually get to lines that I'm cutting on, I'm going to use my knife so that I have some really clear layout. With joinery like this, you end up with people kind of debating what should happen first. For sure, there's people who believe that you absolutely should do one side or the other of the joint to begin with. I feel pretty okay with doing the mortise first. The mortise would be considered like the female side of the joint, and the tenon would be the male side. I don't have the material in my shop right now that I want to use for the tenon. And so I don't think that that's reason for me to stop work and not do the mortises. All that you have to do is make sure that you measure the other side, whichever one it is, off of what you've created rather than off of measurements. So I can say like, this is in 24 inches and it's gonna be 6 inches wide and it's gonna be here, here, and here, and have an idea that's based on numbers. But when it comes down to brass tacks, I'm going to cut my mortises into the bench top. And then when I have the stock for my tenons and legs available, I'm going to put them on the mortise and I'm going to mark the tenons off of the mortise itself so that whatever it is, it's being reflected by reality, not by measurements. Math can get you very far and it's really important, but at the end of the day, if you want a nice clean joint, you have to go off of reality. So the first thing that I need to do here is mark out where I actually want these joints to be. And the video is sped up quite a bit here actually, because it's a surprisingly meticulous and boring process going through all of this. But as you can see, I'm using my Starrett squares to do the pencil lines first, and then I'm going back through with my Olfa knife or like my marking knife and doing all of the lines with knife cuts so that I have a really clean edge to come up against with my chisel when I'm actually cutting out the joint. Big heavy lift. Now that I've got the two vices installed, it's actually quite hefty moving the bench around now. And you'll notice that I've also taken a fair bit of care to differentiate for myself where the joint's actually going to be cut out. And it can seem really silly in the moment to go to so much effort to to tell yourself what's negative and positive space. But when you get into it, it's amazingly easy to kind of forget which side of the line that you're supposed to be cutting on. So I always X out everything that is going to be cut away and carry those lines through to the other side now, because you always want to work from either face. You don't want to be doing any of your cutting with saw, chisel, drilling. You'll see throughout this that you want to work from whatever the face is towards the center of the joint. So here we have it laid out. And next we get to the saw work. So with the sawing, you want to cut just shy of your line. You can get a pretty good view here of the fact that I'm not cutting through my line. You want the line to remain because you're still going to clean up that surface with a chisel, but you want to come as close to it as possible. Also, you'll see that I'm cutting at a diagonal. So I'm cutting down the face that I'm able to see, the face that's towards me, and I'm cutting across the top because those are the two surfaces that I can see from where I am. But I'm not cutting into the surface that's on the other side from me. So I'll go to either side and cut at the diagonal. And then once I'm all the way through, then I'm going to cut the flat when I have the ability to have the saw be guided by the previous cuts that I've made. Otherwise, you find yourself happily doing a really beautiful cut on one surface and you look through the other side and suddenly you realize that you've chopped off something that you really did not intend to chop off. And it's very frustrating. So only cut things that you can actually see. So now the next thing that I want to do is get this material out. A good option would be if I was able to set up a drill press so that I could control the depth and just take out a lot of this material with a drill press, making sure that it wasn't going to go beyond the bottom of the line that I wanted fleshed out. Another option, of course, is I can just use chisels and just chop, chop, chop this all the way back through. And finally, one more option, if we're thinking of this as a dovetail, which it is, then another thing that we can do is essentially use a coping saw to cut diagonally and down to the corner, and then diagonally and down to the corner to flesh out the bulk of the material, and then use the chisels to clean up the sides. Because I don't have a coping saw here, and actually I think that it might be a real pain to try to do this with a coping saw because it's so thick. I think I'm going to use my Japanese saw, and I'm going to just do vertical lines, and that's going to make it easier for me to just chop the material out with my chisel. So I think that's the direction I'm going to go first. As always, there's a lot of different ways that you can make things work. It's just a question of does it work or not? So let's give this a go. So this is the one place that I would say you don't have to be as particular about the sawing technique I was just talking about regarding cutting only the two surfaces that you're looking at one time, because I'm just fleshing out this material. I'm just chopping out lots of stuff, and I'm not too worried about where my line lands. Obviously, I don't want to overcut the line on the other side, so it's hard to tell, but I am leaning across and keeping track that I'm not sinking the line too deep. And you'll see as I chop this out that, you know, I work with the chisels to get the material out, and then eventually I have to deepen my saw cuts a little bit. So I begin with them shy of the line, and then I deepen them as I refine the joint later on. So next up is chop, chop, chop. I've got a 26 millimeter chisel that I'm going to use. This is actually the largest in my kit. Obviously, most of the time that I'm doing joinery, I'm doing much smaller joints. So this is closer to the sort of dimensions that people who are like timber framers are going to be working with. So this is unusual for me, but it's kind of interesting for me to be doing such a large joint. It's like a new it's a new approach. So I'm just going to chop my way through. It's going to look really rough to begin with, and we just refine as we go along. So we start by just getting out as much material as we can. I use a wooden mallet. This one's made of beech. You can get all different mallets of different sizes and shapes and hefts and whatnot. It's good to have decently hardwood for something like this, because if it's softwood, it's just going to get beat to shit really quickly. And yeah. So you want to be using the force of the mallet rather than like trying to push really hard with your hands to push the chisel through the wood. It's not very controlled when you just try and shove yourself against it. So if I was like just trying to jam it in there or like hack at it or something like this, you don't get very controlled strokes with that. Whereas if you use the mallet, you can take your time and kind of work your way through. So let's see how this goes. Remember, I have my knife line at the bottom, so the things that are breaking right at the surface should be breaking at the knife line, and I'm trying not to force too close to that to begin with. I'm not going to worry too much about the triangles at this point. I'm just going to focus on fleshing out the larger space. So actually what's happening right now is a great example of what I was talking about wanting to avoid in getting this joint too close to where the vise is. So this is a perfect example. I've created lots of short grain so that as I add just a little bit of impact, these pieces come away really easily. So if you imagine if I had made this joint closer to the vise, then the amount of wood that was just between them could really easily break away. Obviously, this is like an extreme example, but I think that it illustrates fairly well what I was talking about. So again, same with the sawing, you address the side that you can see. So I can only see this side. I'm chiseling through, but I'm not gonna like just keep going all the way out the other side, because then you blow something out, you have so much more control from the direction that you're arriving from. So the best thing to do is to come in from here, come from that side, and meet in the middle, or you know, wherever you choose to meet. It can be staggered one side or the other, but I guess a good way to think about the the entry and exit of your chisel or your saw would be the same as if you were doing target practice or hunting. If you think about the way that you have the entry of a bullet, it's very small and very clean. And same thing with a chisel or with whatever, you know, you have the side that you're entering from, you get a really clean line. But the exit on the other side is gonna inevitably have way less control and way more chance that it's gonna be a big blown out hole rather than, you know, a little neat line. So I'm just working back and forth here, and I'll come back in with my saw as I start to get the really broad strokes done and clean up these little corners and encourage the grains to be cut short. So this is one of the things that's going to make it the easiest, is if I've got the long grain, those long straws of wood cut into short little pieces, it makes it so that when I come in with my chisel, just those little pieces are going to chip away, and I won't have long pieces that tear away. All right, so that's the rough chopping. I'm going to bring you down here with me so you can get a better look at where we're at. So it's rough, but you can see that I'm keeping above that line. And so when I come in and clean everything, I'm gonna clean up right to the knife line. I'm gonna sharpen my chisel and we'll get to that next. So it can be very easy for us to get caught up in what we're doing, especially with this type of work. It's very long, it's very meditative. That's why I have the video set in such high speed, because this is, you know, what you're looking at in a matter of minutes is days and days of work. And it can be easy to get caught up in that and want to resist the temptation to sharpen our chisel. And it's a really good idea to, you have those moments where you start having something just not cut right, or it's not like really like going pleasingly through the wood. It's like, resist the temptation to just power through that and go sharpen your chisel. So this next step where I have kind of a more true mortise, where there's no entry point for me to put a saw in, then I'm just going with my drill. And as you can see, I keep checking the bottom and the top, so it's the same as I'm doing with everything else. I don't want to just blow out the other side of it because for sure you're going to end up with chips that just go away, even though I've already knife cut all of the lines and, you know, blah, blah, blah. Like, really, again, there's so often we have these temptations to just kind of like take that little shortcut or like really lever against our chisel, or you know, and then you blow this giant chunk out of your piece and you curse yourself and your impatience. So it's really good to remind yourself of best practice when you're doing any of this kind of work. It's like go sharpen your chisel, enter from both sides, take the time to do things right, because that moment when you knock some giant chip out of a place that you didn't intend to, you really curse yourself in those moments. Um, so you'll see, like I have the holes drilled all the way from the top and through the bottom so that they're able to pass all the way through. But with the chisel work that I'm doing right now, I'm not cutting all the way through to the bottom of the bench. I'm making really clean sides from this top, and then I flip the bench over and I'm gonna go on the other side. So here we're getting the like mad blast through high speed version of the rest of this layout and construction. And in some ways, I could have left this out of the video since you've seen sort of one side of it already, but it also gives you a little bit of perspective of like how much time you're really looking at in doing this kind of joinery, quote unquote, by hand. I mean, obviously I'm doing a lot of handwork, but I'm still using power tools to do some of these broad strokes like I am with the drill here. So you really have to decide that you enjoy doing this type of finicky work and fussy stuff. And it can be really, really pleasurable, but you want to like sort of set your metabolism to this lower pace. And you can see by the multiple costume changes that I just keep coming back to this. And you see over and over that like cutting from one side and then the bench has been turned in between and I go along and I cut from the other side. So by this point in the process, you'll see me starting to alternate a bit because sometimes I'm using the hammer and sometimes I'm just using the force of my hands with the chisel. And like I said earlier, you can be very uncontrolled if you're trying to do broad strokes by just like jamming a chisel into something. Once you get to the finer details, then you're probably not going to be using the hammer anymore. You're going to be using the chisel on its own, and at that point, once again, you want to make sure that the chisel's really sharp and you just sort of experiment with your own technique and you start to find the way that you like to be able to force against it. So I often end up standing and putting the butt of the chisel actually against my shoulder or bracing it with my second hand. Like so many things, it's going to be a matter of trying out different techniques and seeing what works for you. This is my OSHA certified halter dress that I'm wearing for this part. And we're getting to the end of this particular part of it. Because it's so long just to do the mortises, and I wanted to give you a sense of the length of it. So, and we're already at a 25-minute video, then the tenons are going to be a separate video. A huge shout out to all my patrons for their support of these videos and of the work that I'm doing, and a big thank you to you for watching. Please like and subscribe if you want to get more of this content, and we'll see you next time.